each person's face has two different sides. Suzuki Roshi had a face in which each half was so totally different from the other that I was fascinated by it. The side with the eyebrow up on the Zen mind, beginner's mind photo, is the mischievous side, and the other is his contemplative side. Richard Baker, Suzuki's American Dharma Air, observes that the right side of his face is the calm, normal, conventional person, and the left side with the eyebrow up is the enlightened side, communicating, showing itself, wondering, skeptical. Who are you? Quote. The Estonian poet Jan Kaplinski refers to this photograph in a poem called Shunryu Suzuki, translated into English with Sam Hamill. Shunryu Suzuki. A little Japanese living and teaching in California couldn't be my teacher, one of my non-teachers. A little lit match from God's matchbox sea wind soon blew out. Somewhere between California and Estonia, somewhere between east and west, between somewhere and nowhere. Nobody can find out what remained of him after the wind has blown and the tide come and gone. The white sand, as smooth as before. But his smile, from the back cover of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, has silently infected book after book on my shelves. And perhaps shelves themselves, and walls and wallpaper too. Houston Smith, the late dean of world religion scholars, was an early fan of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. His preface to the book was included when it went paperback, expanding on what he'd written about D.T. and Shunryu back then. Houston said over the phone, "In my introduction to Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, I allude to my experience with Suzuki Roshi. Anyway, to be affiliated with Suzuki Roshi is a joy, as you understand. I wish I had more to add, but I remember nothing but the wonderful aura, the peace and presentness of the man, his impact upon me. His contribution was immense. Of the two Suzukis, Daisetsu accomplished a major achievement by bringing Zen and, in a way, Mahayana Buddhism to America. Not single-handedly, because there was nyogen senzaki in La, and the first Zen Institute in New York City with Mary Farkas, but as far as the general public was concerned, almost that. And then Shunryu Suzuki comes in a different mode, because far from the public figure that Daisetsu was, Shunryu was quiet, low-key, low-profile. And I do think that the two Suzukis had the most impact. I think of them as complementing each other in a very wonderful way." Houston's comparison reminds me of how once on a bus in New York City, when someone asked if he was D.T. Suzuki, Shunryu replied, "He's the great Suzuki. I'm the little Suzuki." Quote. John Nelson, a professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of San Francisco, who teaches classes on Zen and Buddhism, writes, "What caught my attention was the combination of person, voice, and perspective. The person looked at me from the back cover as if challenging my assumptions about Zen and reality in general. His voice on the page had a unique way of expressing key ideas and explaining the commonplace so that it took on new significance. Zen was not restricted to meditation but permeated all dimensions of life and consciousness. To a young man like myself in Kansas who was sorely disillusioned by Vietnam, race and cultural conflicts, and Watergate, the book offered an entirely new perspective on reality and human behavior." Stephen Tipton, a Suzuki student who teaches sociology and religion at Emory University, wrote, "For all the genius of its cultural and canonical translation, the practical wisdom of this book arises from its communal creation, bred by teacher and students listening and talking to each other in the course of sitting, walking, and working together every day. Through the dance of this dialogue, embodied in a way of life reborn over eons and expressed with poetic grace, comes a truly original and compassionate voice so close at hand it can open our eyes and touch our hearts." The popularity of this book is not so much because people dwell on how great Suzuki was, but because he conveys to readers that they are great. He has confidence that you, whoever you are, can understand Zen, Buddhism, reality, truth, yourself. I've interviewed and talked with hundreds of people about their experience and memories of Suzuki, and over so many have revealed that he, and usually only he, completely understood and appreciated them. And this connection he had with people in person comes through almost like magic in Zen mind, beginner's mind. Read from the hundreds of reviews at Amazon.com and other online outlets. I think they're the most telling, because they were written not by experts assigned to compose reviews, but by readers inspired to share their impression. Buddhism had long been established within Asian American communities when Suzuki arrived in San Francisco to serve as the priest for Japanese Americans at sokoji, the city's Soto Zen temple. But only a handful of people in the West, such as poet Gary Snyder, had worked with a teacher and grown deeply involved with zazen. At the same time, Buddhism had been moving gradually from something lofty to admire from afar into something practical that one could integrate into one's life. The Light of Asia, a biography of the Buddha published in London in 1879, had sold over 1 million copies and been made into a movie in 1928. D.T. Suzuki's and Alan Watts' brilliant books were widely read by seekers as well as scholars. Dwight Goddard's A Buddhist Bible inspired Jack Kerouac and his Beat colleagues, and they inspired many others. Indispensable Sutras, early Buddhist texts, and commentary on them became available through scholars such as Edward Conze. Zen Flesh, Zen Bones by Paul Reps and nyogen senzaki, a retelling of classic koans, was a delight. Such skillful and devoted writing over decades had set the stage for what was to follow. People diving with body and mind into the stream of Buddhism. Buddhist publishing was turning toward books on practice. Enlightenment was being presented as a real possibility, close enough to almost touch. In this vein, Philip Kaplow's landmark 3 Pillars of Zen had come out in 1965, and in 1969 Chogyam Trungpa's Meditation in Action added a Tibetan turn. Shunryu Suzuki brought the Soto emphasis that enlightenment and practice were one. Rick Fields nailed it with the first sentence in his chapter, The 60s. Where there is practice there is enlightenment. This above all was the message Shunryu Suzuki Roshi brought to America. And what is practice? As Suzuki says in this book, instead of having some object of worship, we just concentrate on the activity we do in each moment. Quote, Zen mind, beginner's mind begins with Suzuki saying that the goal of practice is always to keep our beginner's mind limitless and ready for anything. This Eastern tabula rasa is not, however, a blank starting point. It is the point. This is the mind of purity, open to things as they are, or things as it is, as he sometimes said. Suzuki's first teacher, Gyokujin Soon, stressed the importance of beginner's mind. So had Dogen. I'm reminded of the well-known D.T. Suzuki story of the Zen master who poured tea into the overflowing cup of a visiting professor to illustrate that his guest's mind was so full of assumptions and opinions that there was no room to learn anything. It's a perennial spiritual teaching found in various expressions worldwide, such as 14th-century Dominican monk Meister Eckhart's, be willing to be a beginner every single morning. Quote, beginner's mind is the key to awakening to big mind, a favorite term of Suzuki's. Big mind, the absolute, our true nature. Not small mind, the product of our silly idea of self. One of Shunryu Suzuki's closest disciples, Silas Hoadley, remembers Suzuki saying in the early 60s, I've come to destroy your mind. Silas realized that the mind targeted for annihilation was the ego, the small mind, a delusion to begin with, but he said it was still a chilling statement. Suzuki recalled how he and his fellow disciples were losing their beginner's mind in their teens. Through innocently seeing Zen as good, special, a means to gain something. He warned about the perils of being attached to any idea, including that of beginner's mind. We can thank Marion Darby Wisberg, also known as Marion Mountain, for putting together the first draft of this book, as Richard Baker notes in his introduction. She also helped to break the veritable taboo against recording Suzuki's lectures, which were thought of as only for the moment and the people at hand. Zen, he said, was passed on mind to mind. No doubt that's right, but as he also used to say, it's not always so. After 6 years in America, Suzuki's English had greatly improved. With his openness, his beginner's mind, he'd come to know his host country and his students more deeply. The time was ripe for him to begin to leave a record of what he sought to share. We also have Marion's father to thank for asking a question while driving Suzuki from Los Altos to San Francisco. He asked Suzuki what his personal ambition in life was, and Suzuki, surely because he was not talking to a student of his, said, "I'd like to write a book." When her father passed this on to Marion, she took it seriously. She talked to Suzuki about putting together a book from the lectures she'd taped. He agreed. At about the same time, his students in San Francisco likewise began to record his lectures. Of what he said before that time we have accounts of some 30 lectures, many just fragments, based on notes. But from July of 1965 to his final season late in 1971, we now have over 400 partial and complete lecture transcripts, with the audio for more than 280. We're still finding tapes and transcripts not included in the known archive of his talks. Sadly, all but 2 of the tapes for the Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind lectures are lost. Although this book contains lectures from the earliest of Suzuki's recorded talks, they hold up well in comparison to those that followed. Joseph Galevsky, a Zen practitioner and professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at the University of New Mexico, has studied and worked with the Suzuki lecture archive. He remarked that these mid-60s talks from Los Altos are to him the most clear and concise of them all. With that warm, wise way of talking about the Dharma that has become the hallmark of Suzuki Roshi's teaching. Quote, Rinzai Zen priest Eido Shimano, who in 1965 founded the New York Zen Studies Society, proudly showed me his autographed first edition of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and with a nostalgic smile said, "I consider Suzuki Roshi not only as one of the great patriarchs of Zen in America, but also I consider myself as one of his hidden students. I tend to be arrogant. His humility was a great teaching for me." Quote, another Zen teacher who emphasized rigorous practice with koans, Taizen Maizumi, founder of the Zen Center of Los Angeles, said of Suzuki and his legacy, "Nobody can tell you about the past. What's important is not what happened or didn't happen back then. What's important is what we have here now." Even before this century, all kinds of priests in the Zen tradition came to America. We don't really know why, but until he came, no one started anything that lasted. After him, so much happened. That's what I most appreciate. Quote, in 2000 Weatherhill brought out a new edition and, as with the first one, made little of it. Richard Baker, whom Suzuki designated as literary executor of this book, corrected a few misunderstandings from his introduction. There were a couple of mistakes in the chapters, too, one being that Suzuki had, with customary absent-mindedness, attributed the sun-faced Buddha, moon-faced Buddha story to Uman Yunman, rather than Baso Mazu. And no one caught it in time or did anything about it for 30 years. I understand that the Japanese translator took Suzuki to task for that in his introduction. It didn't do well in Japanese. A new Japanese translation published by Samga in 2010, however, has been doing much better, prompting them in 2014 to bring out a translation of Shambhala's Zen is right here. Teaching stories and anecdotes of Shunryu Suzuki, followed by translations of other books by or about him. He's been regarded by the Soto Zen establishment in Japan as overrated in the West, possibly because he acted on his own, not within or through their system of which he was quite critical. But that resistance seems to be thawing. Fred Harriman, a brilliant translator I've worked with, whom I regard as an expert on things Japanese, says that in time they will inevitably come to recognize Shunryu Suzuki in his homeland, because he did something very important to them. He brought something completely Japanese to the West and successfully planted it here. As Maizumi pointed out, we don't really know what happened in the past, but as I see it, a team of people heeded their highest angels to create this book. Marion Darby came up with a manuscript entitled Beginner's Mind, in which she had minimally edited some of the lectures she'd recorded. Suzuki suggested she pass the manuscript on to Baker. She gave it to him in March of 1967 just as Tasahara was preparing for the first practice period. When he finally read it the following fall, he agreed it was good material for a book. After more work, busy with Zen Center's growth and fundraising efforts, he turned for help to Trudy Dixon, a devoted Suzuki student who had worked with Baker to publish Three Seas Windbell periodical, after studying philosophy at Wellesley and UC Berkeley. She agreed, even though she was married with 2 young children and was dealing with breast cancer. The result was a close collaboration. Dixon and Baker would each meet with Suzuki to clarify what he meant in particular passages, and they would also meet together to discuss how best to express his meaning. Dixon devoted the last working energy of her life to this book, honing the language, organizing the talks into 3 sections and deciding on the quotations to head them. As she was dying, she continued to sit zazen, until it became reclining zazen, and finally lying down zazen. She is remembered for her radiant intelligence, spirit, and courage. In October of 1968, at Suzuki's request, Baker sailed for Japan to further study Zen and the culture it was wrapped in there. He went with his wife and daughter, and the nearly completed manuscript. In Tokyo he would find the publisher. Before me is the unedited transcript of a lecture that Suzuki gave in Los Altos on November 11, 1965. A sentence in it reads, "In beginner's mind we have many possibilities, but in expert mind there is not much possibility." In the book, through various stages of editing, that became the often quoted, "In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's there are few." The message is unchanged but it reads better. "I read Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind," Suzuki said once, "to see how my students understand me." Quote, "On that day when the books arrived, Suzuki looked one over, made light of it, hung out the while, and went with his wife back upstairs to their rooms." David Chadwick is the author of Crooked Cucumber, The Life and Zen Teaching of Shunryu Suzuki. Broadway, 1999. And Zen is right here. Teaching stories and anecdotes of Shunryu Suzuki, author of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. Shambhala Publications, 2007. Acknowledgements. Thanks to Stephen Tipton for vetting this Afterword and Victor Sergeyev, Secretary, P.H. Ligatma, publisher of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind in Russian, for pointing out inconsistencies and errors in the Afterword for the 40th anniversary edition of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and a few more errors in the book itself, including correcting the height of the waterfall at Yosemite from 1,340 feet to 1,430 feet. Sources for the quotes in this article, notes, and extensive elaboration can be found at www.zmbm.net. Shunryu Suzuki is reprinted from Wandering Border, 1987, by permission of Copper Canyon Press. Shunryu Suzuki, 1904 to 1971. was one of the most influential spiritual teachers of the 20th century and is truly a founding father of Zen in America. A Japanese priest of the Soto lineage, he taught in the United States from 1959 until his death. He was the founder of the San Francisco Zen Center and the Tassajara Zen Mountain Center. He is also the author of Branching Streams Flow in the Darkness, Zen Talks on the Sandakai, and he is the subject of the biography Crooked Cucumber. Sign up to receive news and special offers from Shambhala Publications. Or visit us online to sign up at shambhala.com. Shambhala.